hello from Frankfurt and good day to everyone, no matter what time zone you're in. Welcome to our session on the impact of emerging technologies on international security and arms control. As Federica said, my name is Niklas Schoernig, and I'm with the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, which is a member of the EU Non-proliferation and Disarmament Consortium. I'm also head of PRIF's new research group on emerging technologies, order and stability, or RETOS in short. I'm really happy to chair today's panel on emerging military technologies. So thank you, Federica, for inviting me today. But before introducing our panelists, let me briefly talk about something completely different. I want to talk about the latest generation of gaming consoles. As especially the younger people in the audience will know, we have witnessed the release of the new Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5 over the last couple of weeks. In insider circles, the latest generation of consoles is always called the next generation or next gen, and every next gen reveal is usually accompanied with great expectations. We have a kind of similar situation here today with this workshop, and I can assure you from looking into the abstracts and PowerPoint slides I received, high expectations are really justified. But let me stick with gaming consoles for another second. To a certain extent, at least, they mirror some of the problems and difficulties we have when assessing emerging military technologies. First, there's always this time when the specification of a new system or of new systems are yet unknown, and people speculate about the actual performances. While some are unimpressed, some observers are unimpressed, others see a revolution leading to totally different buying or policy recommendations. Second, if actor A has the latest system while his neighbor B is still stuck with legacy technology, there's a high chance that B also wants to catch up, one way or the other, fueling non-proliferation and alluring dubious vendors into the market. Drones are a case in point here. However, the comparison breaks once we look at the potential impact, of course. Many emerging military technologies will have severe impact on security and stability, might violate international humanitarian law or ethical standards of warfare. Autonomous weapons, which will select and engage targets without human intervention or control, are a case in point, as are cyber operations, crippling military as well as civilian hardware, or invasive human enhancement, blurring the line between human and machine. What many emerging technologies have in common, however, is that applying proven methods of arms control is tricky, to say the least. While we learned from Naomi's presentation at the last panel that arms control has never been easy, which is true, it was definitely easier during the Cold War days when arms control was essentially bean counting. Many emerging technologies rely on software more than on hardware, and arms controllers have yet to figure out how to regulate software-based capabilities. Hypersonics might be an exception here, as indicated at the last panel. Today, we have three presentations covering a vast field of different emerging technologies with very different yet very interesting research questions addressing many of the issues I just mentioned. Each speaker will be given 10 minutes, and I have been advised by the organizers to enforce a strict regime here. So it's always good to blame someone else if you want to be strict here. As the CVs of our speakers have been passed around, I will just briefly introduce them in the order of the given agenda. First, we have Thomas Brown. Thomas is an associate legal officer at VERTIC, and he received his BA from University of Sheffield and his advanced LLM in public international law from Leiden University. He has working experience as a research fellow for the international law NGO Adala and the private sector, and has been working in the private legal sector in London. Second, we have Fabian Hoffmann. Fabian is a graduate student at King's College London, and he just published an article on the EU as a sanctions actor. However, his most recent research has focused on proliferation of missile technology and its strategic implications, especially with regard to nuclear policy and international arms control, and his presentation will cover this field of his expertise. Finally, we have Marina Favaro. She is a political analyst at the British American Security Information Council, BASIC, and a consultant at King's College London Centre for Science and Security Studies. She recently published some of the findings she's going to present today at the Modern War Institute at West Point's website, and you can find her text there online. One last sentence about all three. All three panelists are very active on Twitter, but have not yet the numbers of followers they deserve. So please go to Twitter after the panel and follow all three. That would be great. Now let us start with the presentations in the given order. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Niklas, for that introduction. I'll just quickly share my screen so you can all see my presentation. Yeah. So thank you again. It's a pleasure to be here and able to present at this workshop and to be able to give my perspective on national implementation of the Biological Weapons Convention in the 21st century and look at some of the challenges that are posed for legislators by emerging technologies. I should say at this point that I am a legal expert rather than a scientific expert, so this presentation will very much focus on the legal side of things, and as I only have 10 minutes, I'm going to go straight ahead and get right to it. So, national implementation of the Biological Weapons Convention. Under Article 4 of the BWC, each state party shall, in accordance with its constitutional processes, take any measures to prohibit and prevent biological weapons. Final documents of BWC review conferences and Security Council Resolution 1540, operative paragraph 2, have shown that this includes the needs for drafting of legislation to implement the convention. Implementing legislation should include a number of relevant provisions, such as definitions, criminal prohibitions and penalties, jurisdictional measures to allow states to exercise control outside their borders sometimes, biosafety and biosecurity measures, transfer control measures to allow for controls over the movement of materials and equipment of proliferation concern, and also legislative enforcement measures so that states can investigate and also prosecute any offences involving biological weapons. So this is the theory behind implementation of the Biological Weapons Convention. However, the reality on the ground is somewhat different. In 2016, VERTIC published a report looking at national implementing legislation of BWC state parties. We surveyed roughly 3/4 of the BWC membership at the time, but unfortunately found quantitative gaps in state parties implementing measures. Many states had yet, at the time, were yet to adopt necessary measures to give effect to certain obligations. There were reasons for such worrying gaps. Many states have priority issues. So the implementation of the Biological Weapons Convention is simply not a political priority for many states around the world. There were valid resource constraints. These are both technical resource constraints, but also financial resource constraints, as the drafting of legislation could be very costly and time-consuming endeavor. And there was often a lack of a suitable legislative framework underpinning. So states often didn't have good legal systems to build upon. All of these gaps that we found in this 2016 report are particularly worrying when you consider emerging technologies and the biological weapons threat landscape. So on the screen, you'll see a number of emerging technologies and trends that can pose challenges to legislators. For example, synthetic biology and DNA technologies in general allow for the amendment of biological materials. Additive manufacturing has the potential to change the processing for biological materials and also equipment of proliferation concern. Digitization of biological data and know-how means that intangible controls are more important than ever. And the democratization of biology has increased the pool of actors which legislatures now need to control. All of these emerging technologies must be considered in light of current threats involving biological weapons. And in this presentation, I'm mainly looking at threats from non-state actors. So in 2019, Indonesian counter-terrorism police arrested members of a terrorist cell for a plot to use the toxin Abrin against civilians. Similarly, this year in Germany, a supporter of the Islamic State was imprisoned for 10 years for a plot to use the toxin ricin in a bomb to attack civilians. And during this unfortunate COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a number of nefarious non-state actors around the world who have been attempting to spread the disease through so-called coughing attacks. Different states have responded to this in different ways, but in the United States, prosecutors have in fact used biological weapons implementing legislation to prosecute such offences. I'll now look at two challenges of how emerging technologies can challenge biological weapons legislation. So the first challenge I want to introduce is that emerging technologies can challenge the very definition of what a biological weapon is. Under Article 1 of the BWC, a biological weapon is an agent or toxin, whatever origin or method of production, that has no justification for peaceful purposes. States, when drafting implementing legislation, have to adopt definitions for key terms such as biological weapon and biological agent and toxins, for example. Under Article 1 of the BWC, this definition is called the general purpose criterion. However, in practice, something that came out of the 2016 report, and something that I also see in my daily work, is that some states incorrectly transpose the general purpose criterion into their legislation. For example, certain states would miss out the part on all non-peaceful purposes or method of production, for example. Other states miss out toxins, so only cover biological agents, or miss out other key definitions. Any legislative errors such as this are particularly worrying when we consider the new emerging technologies of synthetic biology, for example, which can blur traditional understandings of biology and challenge the definition. Incorrectly drafted legislation that does not correctly transpose the general purpose criterion under Article 1 could mean that synthetically created biological agents are not covered. And as you will see later in this presentation, if any gaps in legislation can have very serious consequences when it comes to prosecutions. A second challenge is the area of transfer controls. So under Article 3 of the Biological Weapons Convention, transfers of biological weapons are prohibited, but this must be balanced with Article 10 of the Biological Weapons Convention, which ensures that states do not restrict or limit transfers of materials and technologies for peaceful purposes. So when states are drafting a law to implement the Biological Weapons Convention, they must control transfers of certain biological agents and toxins. States often do this through the adoption of controlled agents and toxins lists, and also lists of related equipment and technology. They may also choose to implement other transfer licensing systems, for example. However, the 2016 report again showed that many states lack the necessary controls. Less than a quarter of the states that we looked at actually had the necessary lists of biological agents, toxins, equipment, and technology, and allowed for them to be regularly updated, as is necessary in light of new technology. Moreover, many states lack things such as catch-all controls. This is, again, particularly worrying when we consider emerging technologies. Legislators need to look at how to control intangible transfers of know-how, as biological data, build files, technologies are harder to control than ever. More and more is moving online. There are fears that additive manufacturing and 3D printing technologies could mean that manufacturing processes now bypass export control regimes and transport control regimes, and much 3D technology is actually not currently part of multilateral export control regimes. There is an issue of synthesis of new pathogens also, because that could challenge the control lists, and non-state actors could, for example, alter a pathogen that is on the list, or amend a pathogen that's not on a control list and make it weaponizable or more dangerous. And finally, we need to look at the use of the darknet as a source for biological materials and toxins. The darknet as a non-conventional trade flow is much harder to regulate, but we've seen in a number of cases from around the world, including the case that I mentioned before in Germany, that this is increasingly a source that non-state actors are looking to try and source biological materials and toxins, as it's much harder to track. So I'll now present very briefly two case studies, real-life case studies, that show challenges to national implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention. One positive case study and unfortunately one negative case study. So on your screen here, you will see the first case study, which some of you may be aware of. It was a case in the Netherlands where researchers were able to make avian flu transmissible between mammals. The Dutch government held that they needed to apply for an export license before emailing their article to publishers in the United States, as this avian flu was a dual-use item, including technology related to avian flu under EU Regulation 428/2009. The researchers were opposed to this. They cited academic freedom and said that such a need for an export license put them at a competitive disadvantage when compared with researchers from other areas of the world. They did apply for a license, but they challenged the process in court. They lost the case actually at a district level, the court finding that it was right that they had to apply for an export license. And this, for me, this shows the importance of controls over intangible technologies of dual use concern. However, a more negative example, which doesn't actually concern emerging technologies per se, but does show the issues that can arise when states incorrectly draft BWC implementing legislation. So in 2017 in the US, a man was accused of possessing the toxin ricin without permission. However, when the case went to court, it was found that a legislative error after an update to regulations meant that at that time, it was not currently a federal crime to possess ricin without permission. The judge ruled that this was just simply a legislative error, that ricin had been moved onto the wrong list, and it was. But however, they also ruled that it was not the court's place to remedy such an error. That was the role of Congress. This led to the charges being dismissed in this case, and the defendant was set free. This error was rectified by law 2 years later, in 2019, by an act of Congress. However, it does show that the real life consequences of mistakes in legislation. So how can we remedy some of these gaps? And to conclude, there is a need for a comprehensive approach to drafting biological weapons convention implementing legislation. Emerging technologies can challenge even the most advanced legislative systems and have the potential to exacerbate gaps. We've already seen throughout this presentation that there are significant gaps in many states' legislation, and the US case shows that mistakes in legislation can have very, very serious consequences when it comes to prosecutions for some of the most serious crimes. Therefore, comprehensive legislation that's regularly reviewed and updated with input from key stakeholders and also the scientific community can remedy these issues. Now, it's important to note that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to legislation, and each state will draft legislation that fits in with their constitutional processes and their needs at the time. However, I personally would advocate for the use of secondary legislation, so regulations, for many of the control measures that I've identified throughout this presentation. That's because regulations can be updated a lot more quickly and easily in light of new changes in science and technology. Finally, I would encourage states to seek assistance where necessary. This can be financial or technical assistance, and there are technical assistance providers out there, such as VERTIC, to help with the drafting of comprehensive BWC implementing legislation. Thank you very much for the presentation, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for reminding us that we don't have to look at the international level all the time, but that we can have small advances on the national level as well without having to go or to align with others. That's a very important issue here. Now I would hand over the floor to Fabian Hoffmann. And Fabian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm quickly going to start my presentation. Here we are. Can everybody see it?
I can, so I think the rest can.
That should be right. Perfect. I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you very much. Today I'm going to talk about missile proliferation, trends, strategic implications, and also counter-proliferation. So let's get right started. If you look at the international system today, we see that we are confronted by an unprecedented number of missile systems. How do I define a missile system? I define it as a guided airborne weapon capable of delivering a warhead over a certain distance, which usually consists of the following subsystems: propulsion, guidance, warhead, and also control unit that integrates these subsystems. Several systems fall under this definition. For one thing, we have tactical missiles, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, hypersonic glide vehicles, cruise UAVs, or so-called suicide drones. And you could also include air-to-surface missiles, such as ballistic missile defense and anti-satellite weapons. What's the implication of that? And we see that we are faced by an increasingly complex missile landscape, and sometimes conceptual boundaries between different missile systems blur. So for example, where exactly does a tactical missile end and a cruise missile start? Or what exactly is the difference between a cruise missile and a cruise UAV? So this can complicate arms control and non-proliferation agreements. In addition, some of these missile systems have very unfortunate destabilizing implications, which exerts pressure on the international system. Today, I want to focus on a particular type of missile system, so-called long-range precision strike capabilities, arguably a very important emerging technology in the international system right now. Let's first look at some general trends in regard to, here, very quickly, under this category, we have ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and also hypersonic light vehicles. Let's look at some general trends in regard to these missile systems. On the horizontal proliferation side, we see that the horizontal spread of ballistic missiles has been slowed significantly, most likely due to the successful working of the Hague Code of Conduct in regard to ballistic missiles. However, we've seen a significant proliferation of cruise missiles, also to non-traditional possessor states. With that, I mean states that are not usually affiliated with most advanced defense industries. And more recently, we've also seen a limited spread of hypersonic light vehicles, but here's the question for how long the spread will be limited. On the vertical proliferation side, we continue to see a modernization of ICBM forces in nuclear weapon states, and more recently, we've also seen an increased vertical proliferation of theater-range ballistic missiles. The development and acquisition of more and more sophisticated cruise missiles, both land attack and anti-ship cruise missiles, continues. And it can also be expected that the vertical proliferation of hypersonic capabilities takes place once first-generation systems are deployed. Let's dive a bit more into emerging missile technology. Contemporary missile technology enables longer ranges, higher kill probabilities, precision strikes, and complex mission planning. I want to talk about that in a bit more detail. First, when we look at longer ranges, what you see here are two graphs. Here I plotted the speed and range distribution of tactical and cruise missiles throughout 2 periods of time. On the left side, from 1960 to 1989, you see that the vast majority of missile systems developed during this period of time were below the 500-kilometer range threshold indicated on the x-axis. If we go to the second period of time, from 1989 to 2019, you see that this trend roughly continues. At the same time, you also see many more missiles that are now above the 500-kilometer range threshold. How do we explain that? Well, I think for one thing, it's the motivation of actors. So like states wanted to acquire standoff range capabilities, but at the same time, the technology that enables such capabilities is also increasingly available. Let's look at the higher kill probabilities. Much of this has to do with improved warhead designs. We see that modern missile capabilities, and especially long-range strike capabilities, they have multiple warhead designs. Often they incorporate a primary charge, which is used to puncture or weaken the structure that is engaged by the missile, while then a secondary charge, a so-called follow-through bomb, is used to penetrate the structure and cause maximum amount of damage. And this combined warhead design enables to engage even hardened targets such as bunkers and silos. Also, the kill probability is enhanced by better survivability, which is due to improved maneuverability and complex non-ballistic trajectories, and also improved stealth capabilities. So long-range precision strike capabilities often go to great lengths to minimize the infrared and radar emissions. Lastly, trend 3, precision strikes and complex mission planning. This is mostly enabled by much improved guidance systems. For example, we see that GPS navigation is increasingly available to a variety of actors, and more missiles incorporate data links, which enable the missile to communicate mid-air with its operator and also with other missiles, which allows it to change engagement plans during the flight, which of course enables more complex missions. On the terminal guidance side, we see that effective target recognition software becomes increasingly available. This is really important as it enables the missile system to engage its target much more precisely and cause damage will wreak the most havoc. And here's also a huge potential for AI enhancement in the future, but it already takes place. Let's look at some of the strategic implications of long-range precision strike proliferation. And this proliferation is global, and so the implications are also global. But due to the limited scope of this presentation, I want to focus on Europe and Russia, more precisely on what it means for European states and the strategic competition with Russia. And as always, we do not live in a black and white world. So there will always be strategic benefits we have to keep in mind, but also drawbacks. And so when you look first at the benefits. For one thing, long-range precision strike capabilities allow possessor states, like for example Finland or Germany, to hold at risk valuable targets deep inside Russian territory, thus providing a valuable deterrence and escalation management tool. Second, because an increasingly large number of states in Western and Central Europe possesses these systems, the number of potential retaliatory decision-making centers increases as well, and this provides the NATO alliance with much improved and credible deterrence posture. Third, in a conventional warfighting scenario, long-range precision strike capabilities may provide significant value by threatening the enemy's rear, its supply lines, and also logistical hubs. But then we, of course, also have strategic drawbacks, and these are significant. For one thing, because long-range precision strike systems are inherently difficult to counter with existing technology, NATO and Russia tend to counter these capabilities by building up their own long-range precision strike capabilities, thus fueling a security dilemma and arms race. Second, in case of deterrence failure, the aforementioned counter-value strikes may prove highly escalatory, especially due to the fact that Russia, as a nuclear weapon state, still holds escalation dominance. Third, long-range precision strike capabilities are particularly useful and effective when used in preemptive scenarios, but relatively vulnerable during ongoing hostilities. This may introduce a use them or lose them mentality into interstate relations, which of course is highly destabilizing. And lastly, the proliferation of increasingly precise and powerful long-range precision strike capabilities makes a successful nuclear strike more likely. For example, Russia may fear that European states use these capabilities in conjunction with a US nuclear strike in order to decapacitate Russian leadership or destroy its retaliatory nuclear capabilities. Thus, it undermines strategic stability. So I believe that these drawbacks heavily outweigh the benefits, and therefore we should strive to regulate and control long-range precision strike capabilities in some way. I think the best way to do so would be to first follow a short-term agenda while also keeping a long-term agenda in mind. On a short-term agenda, I think it is really important to define and clearly demarcate individual missile systems in order to facilitate a trust and confidence among state actors. As I stated in the very beginning of my presentation, sometimes the conceptual boundaries may blur. And I think think tanks and universities can play a key role here in facilitating future arms control non-proliferation agreements. Second, possessor states should work out rules of conduct for long-range precision strike capabilities concerning use and deployment without at first necessarily limiting the number. So for example, they could agree that these systems may not be deployed within a 100-kilometer range of an international border, not within 100 kilometers of an international border, and they should agree on crisis communication rules and standards. Third, these possessor states should also enhance transparency with regard to long-range precision strike systems by clarifying doctrinal use and purpose of deployment. So for example, non-nuclear weapon states should unequivocally state that these precision strike capabilities do not have a counterforce use, whereas nuclear states should clarify which systems are armed with conventional and which ones with nuclear payload in order to prevent misperception and misunderstandings. On the long-term agenda, I think it is really important that we restart conventional arms control and also start thinking about how to integrate conventional and nuclear arms control, especially due to the strategic implications even of conventionally armed long-range precision strike capabilities. Next, we finally have to engage the issue of missile defense comprehensively, seeing that fear of missile defense constitutes a major driver of missile proliferation, especially in China and Russia. Third and lastly, at one point, we also have to talk about quantitatively limiting missile systems. And I think one way to do so would be, for example, to introduce missile ratios into the arsenals of possessor states. We can talk about it more in the Q&A if you're interested. For now, I want to thank you for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or a message on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fabian. But everyone keep in mind you can ask questions later on, so you don't have to send them per email later, but you can use the chat function or raise your hands later on. So now, last but not least, we have the presentation by Marina. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. I've just shared my screen. I hope you can all see it all right. All right, let's get started. So thank you to the organizers for having me here today. My name is Marina Favaro, and I work on the intersection of emerging technologies and nuclear risk at the London-based think tank VERTIC and at King's College London. So in this presentation, I'll aim to give you a more nuanced take on how so-called emerging technologies impact the nuclear realm and share with you a piece of research that I did a few months ago. So here is our agenda for the day. I'm going to look at what is strategic stability, what are emerging technologies, how are emerging technologies relevant to strategic stability, and share my research. I'm actually just going to make sure that I'm sharing the right screen here. One second. Here we go. Alrighty. So beginning with what is strategic stability. Thankfully, I'm not the only one still asking this question in 2020. So this tweet is something that I came across in my research, and I found it really interesting to see people in the nuclear policy field couldn't reach a consensus. So there are many different opinions on this. The definition that I go with is a state of affairs in which countries are confident that their adversaries would not be able to undermine their nuclear deterrent capability. In other words, this is the stability that comes from the knowledge that nuclear weapons can be used in nuclear retaliation to any first strike. So without going into too much detail on nuclear deterrence, this definition focuses on the reduced likelihood that a state will use nuclear weapons because of the knowledge that nuclear weapons will be used in retaliation. So a strategically stable relationship is thus one in which you're confident that your adversary will not remove this deterrent, for example, by building a super advanced missile defense system that could prevent a retaliatory strike. So some of you may already be thinking about some of the limitations inherent in this definition, which I've listed here, but we won't actually have time to go into these today. So what are emerging technologies? At its core, emerging technology refers to one of two things, so either new technologies or new applications of existing technologies. On the second point, it's important to note that some of what gets lumped into the category of so-called emerging tech has actually been around for decades, but cyber and space have only been recently acknowledged as operating domains by NATO. So cyber in 2016 and space in 2019. Here I've listed three examples. We have quantum computing, hypersonic missiles, and AI. Next, I want to talk about how emerging technologies are relevant to strategic stability. So the way that I see it, emerging technology can provide new ways to stop or use nuclear weapons. So AI for missile defense could significantly alter the deterrence calculation. They could blur the boundary between nuclear and non-nuclear infrastructure. This speaks to the dual-use nature of satellites and potential for misidentification or unintended escalation. Third, they could create new vulnerabilities within existing systems, which could include cyber attacks on civilian infrastructure. And finally, they can change the game. This is to say that emerging technologies are more accessible to a wider group of actors, and attribution is more difficult. However, I would say that emerging technologies are not the first time that nuclear systems have been susceptible to outside interference, attack, and possible sabotage. And the bottom line for me really is we've always had to contend with new technologies, and it's too easy to forget what was considered emerging and when, which brings me to my next slide. So I think it's important to frame this discussion as the more things change, the more they stay the same. War never changes is the catchphrase of the Fallout series, and it's also a Ulysses S. Grant quote. And the historian in me can't help but to emphasize that continuity and change are twin forces. So continuity doesn't mean that nothing changes, but rather it helps to sober overblown claims that something is a so-called revolution in military affairs. So what we've determined so far is strategic stability is difficult to define and may or may not be applicable to today's multipolar system. Emerging tech is a bit of a misleading moniker. Emerging technologies may impact strategic stability, but we need to be aware of newness, which brings me to the question, how do we meaningfully contribute to this area of research and policy? I don't think it's sufficient to say that emerging tech is elusive and throw our hands up. So how do we do this work in a way that is measured and not alarmist, but rather allows us to systematically evaluate potentially disruptive technologies? And this brings me to the research that I've done. So I want to tell you a bit about a project that I designed and ran, which endeavors to address the intersection between so-called emerging tech and strategic stability. This was an independent research project that I produced for the UK Pony Conference and is being brought into its next stage under the auspices of King's College London as part of Heather Williams's project on bridge building and the nuclear order. So in order to accomplish the objectives that I set out at the beginning, I used the STREAM method. And the STREAM method was developed by Stephen Popper and his RAND colleagues, and it's a method that was designed to assess current and potential technologies according to a range of impact and implementation criteria. Now, what does this mean? Well, comparing the impacts of heterogeneous technologies side by side can be very challenging, especially when we're looking at two operating domains. I like to say it's the policy equivalent of comparing apples with oranges. So what the STREAM approach allows us to do is it allows us to account for this difficulty by taking a systematic approach to assessing these technologies. If you'd like to learn more about this method, my conference paper was just published this month, or we can talk about it more in the Q&A section. So 21 space and cyber technologies were selected for their potential to tilt the balance of terror one way or the other. These were chosen for their potential to replicate, offset, or mitigate the effects of nuclear weapons, and therefore have the potential to upset some aspects of strategic stability. So this slide is essentially the culmination of the STREAM method, whereby subject matter experts were sent a bespoke questionnaire that looks like this, accounting for 21 technologies in the columns, not just the 4 that you see here, and they returned something that looks like this. When I was doing the data analysis, in order to analyze the quantitative findings and prioritize these technologies, I used this framework, which has 5 aspects: technological maturity, rate of development, capability increase, ease of countering, and crisis instability. I do break down the research findings for each of these 5 aspects, but I don't have enough time to cover that in our presentation today. So if you'd like to learn more, they are covered in the conference paper. But in the interest of time, I want to skip to my highest level findings. So in these high level findings, I combined some of the metrics in order to get a more nuanced overview of the impact of these technologies on strategic stability. So beginning with combining technological maturity with the rate of development, we can get a better idea of where these technologies are right now and how quickly they might reach maturity if they're not already at a high level of maturity. So this graph shows differing ethical barriers between the UK and its allies versus the UK's adversaries on the x-axis, differing practical barriers on the y-axis, and the size and color of the bubbles corresponds to the technological maturity of each capability. So the technologies highlighted in red are both at a moderate maturity level with lower ethical barriers for the UK's adversaries relative to the UK and its allies, and have about the same practical barriers for both parties. Cyber attacks on biotechnology over here is technologically immature, but it has the greatest, yes, that's right. It is technologically immature, but it has the greatest disparity in ethical barriers between the UK and its allies versus its adversaries, meaning that its development could happen quite quickly. On the other hand, over here we have UAVs, which are very mature technologically, but the lower ethical barriers for the UK's adversaries might mean that they're less constrained in their deployment of this technology. Next, I combine capability increase, ease of countering, and crisis instability, and we get this graph, which shows the increase in capability on the x-axis and the difficulty in countering that technology on the y-axis. And here, the size and color of each bubble corresponds to that technology's ability to accelerate crisis instability. This slide shows that the technologies that are highlighted in red, i.e. hypersonics and AI-trained offensive cyber attacks, will significantly increase capabilities, are difficult to counter, and are highly likely to accelerate crisis instability. The technologies highlighted in amber over here will have a similar impact on capabilities and are similarly difficult to counter, but they're slightly less likely to accelerate crisis instability. So all the highlighted technologies on the slide will have a significant impact on strategic stability, just for different reasons. Finally, pulling all the quantitative results together, I used an addition method, which was the simplest way that I saw to combine all 5 factors. A more nuanced model, a more advanced model could capture these results in a more nuanced way or include factors that I left out here. But this was really meant to be a foundational study, and it will be developed further in the coming months. So what this gives us are the top 5 technologies with the largest impact on strategic stability. This includes AI-trained defensive cyber attacks, hypersonic missiles, rendezvous and proximity operations, direct descent anti-satellite weapons, and satellite jamming systems. In addition to the quantitative results, there was also a huge amount of qualitative remarks that came from comments within the scoring exercise, as well as from an exercise debrief. Again, I don't think we'll have time to go through these now, but I'd be happy to pick these up in the Q&A section, and they're explored in detail in the conference paper as well. So to wrap this all up, the so what for me is that the STREAM method provided a rigorous framework through which I accomplished my 3 objectives. The benefits to using this approach is it can be really difficult to cut through hype and misinformation. So using a method that is more systematic helps us to do that and more robust. Also, comparing technologies, especially across 2 domains, can feel like comparing apples and oranges. And futures and foresight methods are as much about the process as they are about the outcome. So it's about getting important stakeholders to think about these issues in new ways and break the kind of habitual thinking that we have around these policy problems. So this was a very collaborative effort, as you might be able to tell from all the data that I have. It was hugely due to all the interviewees and those who did the STREAM scoring exercise. So I'm very grateful to all my friends and colleagues who contributed to this study. And that's all from me. Looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting to see. And I remember like 10 years ago when we had a conference on drones and the potential impact of armed drones, there was a Russian colleague presenting some maps where he said, well, this can have an impact on strategic stability by when you use drones to attack our nuclear arsenals. And everyone in the room couldn't understand what he was talking about because everyone was still thinking in silos. There's conventional and there's nuclear. And what I've learned from all your presentations is that we have to break those silos open and to integrate stuff into each other. However, the floor is now open, and if I understand it correctly, I should see raised hands if people want to participate or want to say something. I don't see any raised hands, so I will just pitch that back, this idea of breaking up silos to you, and we will wait for other questions. Who wants to go first? There is, okay. Okay, there is a question, hang on, from Alex Nadal. So can everyone see the question or do I have to read it? So who wants to answer the, okay, I have to read because we can see it, but not the other people outside our group here. So the US 2018 Nuclear Posture Review acknowledged that strategic stability now expands beyond the nuclear realm to include non-nuclear strategic capabilities, cyber threats to US command and control structures, and hypersonic vehicles. Would this facilitate future arms control agreements with, say, Russia, which has long argued that non-nuclear capabilities also affect strategic stability? This nicely connects to my comment on the Russian colleague like 10 years ago. So who wants to answer? Fabian, please.
I can go first. So I think it's great that we have some common understanding here now, and that both Russia and the US understand that non-nuclear weapons can have strategic implications as well. Whether or not this facilitates arms control agreements, I'm a bit more pessimistic. I think what we have to see and understand is that both Russia and the US have used these long-range precision strike capabilities in various conflict scenarios in the past, and also other non-nuclear capabilities, cyber operations, and most certainly they will come up with usage for hypersonic capabilities in non-nuclear scenarios. So I think these actors will be extremely hesitant to give up the right to deploy these systems. That being said, so deploy them unregulated, but that being said, obviously we should still try to get them on the table and discuss it, because I think there's absolutely no way of getting around the fact that in future nuclear arms control will have to incorporate both systems, nuclear and non-nuclear strategic systems. Thanks.
Anyone else who wants to pitch in? Otherwise, we have a new question from. So, if I'm too fast, just open up your mic and stop me. Otherwise, I'll continue with the next question from Manuel Herrera. The question is to Fabian and Marina. So, and the question is, what implications do you think your findings and conclusions may have in terms of foreign policy formulation and decision making? Marina, maybe do you want? Yeah. Sure,
I can start. So I think first, I acknowledge there's lots of limitations to my study. This is something that I did basically in my evenings and weekends as in the lead up to the UK Pony conference, because I actually was accepted to speak at the conference and then had said that I would be presenting on emerging technologies and nuclear risk, but actually had nothing to present on just yet. So this is something that I threw together with the help of many colleagues and friends who served as survey respondents. But I think I want to first acknowledge that this is a small N research respondent pool, and in future iterations, it will be, the findings might be more robust. But I think that is to say that the way I see this research and futures and foresight research in general, it's, like I said, as much about the process as it is about the outcome. So while we do get an interesting outcome and we can see how different technologies are assessed on different criteria, so how the technological maturity interplays with the rate of development, or how the crisis instability or the potential to accelerate crisis instability interplays with something like the ease of its countering. I think those are interesting findings, but I do think that there's something to be said about getting policymakers in the room and talking about these issues in a way that they don't usually talk about it. So breaking up habitual thinking and trying to use the same language, so that is the kind of evaluation of the technologies, to talk about very disparate technologies. And I think that in itself is a real benefit of using this method and using futures and foresight methods in general. So I guess that is to say that it's not just the ultimate findings that come out of this and the data crunching that could have relevance to foreign policy formulation and decision making, but also the way in which we talk about these things, the way in which we break down these silos. I think that in itself has a lot of merit.
Yeah, I think if I may take over the concept of maturity from Marina, I think if you look at these long-range precision strike capabilities, they've already achieved an extremely high level of maturity in the arsenals of a number of states. And we're not only talking about the US and Russia here. And an issue is that from now on, these systems will only become more capable as warheads become more powerful, as AI enhancement will take place, as more emerging technology gets integrated. So I think maybe the most important foreign policy implication or for decision makers would be that these systems need to be brought back to or maybe not even brought back to the negotiation table, but like they have to be brought to the negotiation table. And I think we already see it to some extent. Germany and Sweden, if I'm not incorrect, together with the Institute for International Strategic Studies, have started the Missile Dialogue Initiative, which is a roundtable initiative where they convene experts on missiles, where they discuss technological developments and strategic implications. And I think that is really important. But the next step that we have to see is that these topics are being picked up on the international level by the relevant actors.
Thank you very much. The next question also goes to Fabian. So obviously the strategic stability and missile issue is moving our audience. So Sibylle Bauer from CPRI asks, what specific steps do you propose to restart conventional arms control and integrate conventional and strategic arms control as you suggested in your last slide?
That's a great question, and I was always happy that I could just put it on the last slide, as just putting it out there, and under the excuse, okay, I'm running out of time. I think the burden here falls on the P5 to make the first step, and that would probably be also the most, just the best thing if that were to happen. And I understand that start talking about it with 5 actors is extremely difficult. And while I think this would be the most efficient step, it could also just be that when the Biden administration takes over and they start an extension, start talking about extending, or I hope they extend New START, but then also start to negotiate it with the Russians and how to proceed in the future, that they just pick up the issue of conventional weapons and that they start talking about the strategic implications of these non-nuclear systems. But that being said, I think it's an extremely complicated issue. And unfortunately, I don't have a final answer here.
I think if you had, many people would be unemployed, and that would. So, because this is the $1 million question, I guess. I'm switching the order of questions because the next one is already going to nuclear cruise missiles, but I want to pitch a question to Thomas first. Sibylle Bauer again asks, could you outline difficult challenges in the you outlined difficult challenges in the biofield. How can they be addressed, for example, by the EU?
Thank you very much for that question. So I think the EU and EU member states have an important role to play as standard setters, because when we consider things like implementing legislation, many EU member states already have quite advanced legislative systems in place. And as I mentioned in my presentation, for example, EU regulation on dual-use controls and transfers, for example, is already a kind of international standard. So for example, if I go to a workshop and I talk to other states and they look at control lists, they might look at the EU control lists. So I think that's probably the main role that I see for the EU. I think the EU already does a lot of fantastic work in this field through the CBRN Centre of Excellence program, for example, that I've been involved. And also, I think member states can be involved in bilateral conversations with other states who potentially do not have as advanced legislative frameworks in place to help them share best practices. I also think that EU member states, with a lot of these emerging technologies, they are the producers of these emerging technologies at the moment, and many of the labs are in EU member states, so the controls need to be very rigorous in the EU, and we need to, especially in the case of transfer controls, for example. So there's a responsibility there, I think, as producers to ensure that any of these materials or equipment are not being transferred outside of the EU for nefarious purposes. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we go back to the question by Douglas Rocha. And I think this goes to Marina and Fabian, or you could both pick up the question. Could the proliferation of nuclear cruise missiles indicate a preference for this category of missiles as nuclear vectors in the future, perhaps surpassing the importance of ballistic missiles in arms control? Who wants to go first? Fabian, maybe?
Sure thing. I think it's a great question. Well, first of all, I think that at least for the foreseeable future, that intercontinental ballistic missiles will continue to constitute the core of the nuclear deterrent of nuclear weapon states. That being said, the importance of cruise missiles as part of the nuclear deterrent also greatly depends on some technological developments. For now, the I think the cruise missiles would probably only come into question if we talk about really fast systems, right? So like we don't want them to be in the subsonic spectrum. So probably we talk about at least supersonic or hypersonic cruise missiles. Otherwise, I don't think it makes sense to switch them for ICBMs. But right now, for example, what we see is that most of the cruise missiles above the subsonic range spectrum, they still have liquid fuel. And we know that in order to start missiles really fast and to have them engagement ready in a certain amount of time that is appropriate, we need to have solid fuel. And so here technology is actually lagging behind. And I think at least until we have reliable solid fuels for supersonic or hypersonic cruise missiles, they will definitely not replace ICBMs. Really quickly, MBDA, Bavaria Chemicals, they have developed a solid fuel for ramjet engines, but this is not enough for hypersonic. So for hypersonic, you need scramjet engines. So actually right now, we do not have solid fuels for scramjet engines. And I would just say for now, maybe we can focus a bit on that. And that's why for the foreseeable future, ICBMs will still be the primary system, I believe.
Marina, do you want to chip in? Or?
No, that's all right. I'm happy with Fabian's answer, and I'm definitely not a missile technologist.
Okay, so the next question goes again to Thomas. It's from Tom Hickey, and he asks, one of the main problems with the Biological Weapons Convention has always been verification. Unlike CWC with OPCW, WC does not really have any kind of monitoring verification regulatory body. Given the difficulty in monitoring global bioactivities, is there any way to reliably cover bio? Are strengthening national controls the most effective way to do this? National, e.g., what do you think? E.g., what do you think of recent Kazakh proposals to create international agency for biological safety?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but essentially, I think the problem that Tom identified is a huge one in the BWC regime. The lack of a body, for example, such as the OPCW. It's been a long-standing issue. It's an historic issue, and I think states have been looking to remedy this for a long time. Ideas of a verification protocol, but they've never really kind of got off the ground. A lot of these initiatives. I would hope for the creation of something at some point, but whether or not that will be possible, it's difficult to say. I'm aware of the Kazakh proposal, and I read it briefly, but I'm not by no means an expert on it. But on the face of it, I would say it's something that could be promising. I would hope that the COVID-19 pandemic and the increased awareness of biothreats. I mean, every state around the world now is very much aware of the huge impacts that biological agents and the spread of those agents can have. So I would hope that that would focus minds and policymakers, and we would be able to come to some kind of international agreement on some kind of agency. I think in the absence of that, which is essentially why I do my job and why VERTIC is doing the National Implementation Measures Programme, is that, yes, I would say that the national controls are the most effective way. I mean, there are international frameworks through the BWC framework, things like confidence building measures do help to build trust between states. But really, especially when we consider the growing non-state actor threat, national controls are incredibly important. National controls must be supported by international dialogue, of course, but in the absence of a framework, I do believe that national controls are essentially the only way at the moment to monitor so many of these activities, and which is why the gaps in such controls are so worrying.
Thank you very much. Now there's a question by Jürgen Altmann, but I do not know whom he is actually posing the question to. So Jürgen, could you please specify whom you want to answer your question on the EU policy? So while Jürgen will reframe the question a little bit. I would pass on a question by Sibylle Bauer to Marina. First question is, it's actually two questions. First, do you think the term emerging tech is still useful, or should we use or invent a different one? Second, gender balance in emerging technology at events and in the academic field is far from what it should be. How can this be changed? But I think the second question could be passed on to the male participants as well. It's not just for the woman to answer here.
Great, thank you very much for these questions. I think they're both great ones. On the first, this is something that I think about all the time. In fact, I was tasked myself with renaming BASIC's emerging tech portfolio because I thought, do you know what? This terminology is so riddled with issues and no one knows what it means and it's misleading and these technologies aren't emerging that we're worried about. It's just the operational domains that we're seeing as new, not the technology itself in many cases, not in every case. But for all the thinking that I've done on it, thinking disruptive technologies, perhaps that's better, but that has a very specific meaning in the kind of NATO context. And so I think I've done a lot of brainstorming on this and I've come back to, in the same way that cyber as a moniker is misleading and perhaps inappropriate, and some people suggest that we should just throw it out entirely, it's the best that we have and it's the closest that we have to almost a common language. And so I agree that it's imprecise and misleading and all these other things, but I think that it's the only way to be pulling, maybe one thing, having these conversations between experts, and secondly, bringing more people into these conversations because they can identify with what we mean by emerging tech, but maybe they feel like a conversation around something more specific they couldn't speak to. So it's imperfect, and I think it's the best that we have right now. So that's my answer to the first one. And I think on your second point, this is a really interesting one and also something that I think about a lot. I come from a background of kind of feminist international securities, like critical security studies. And I think a lot about gender balance in the security space and in emerging technologies specifically. I think it's partially attributable to the underrepresentation of women in STEM fields. And so there's not, we can have a whole conversation. We could have another panel on barriers to women's participation in these spaces. But I, for one, feel like the people that I speak to on a day-to-day basis there are so many amazing women experts in this space. And I just had a workshop yesterday we were scoping the next phase of this project with the KCL team. And, you know, the group ended up being predominantly women, not because we had any political agenda, but because we wanted the most qualified people in the room and friends and colleagues to be participating in this and getting their insights. And yeah, I'm just always amazed at the amazing women that are in this field and how much mentorship happens within that community and how much advocating for each other there is. So I think that's a really positive note, and it's just a matter of, if there's not enough women on your panels or your manels or whatever, it's just a matter of putting in the legwork, because there are very many qualified women in this space. Yeah.
Anyone else who wants to comment?
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I think especially like young women, they're right now. There's so many mentorship opportunities available, and all these people in this field that I talk to, they are so amazing, and they will pick you up on that. So, you know, if there's someone out there who's not entirely sure but insecure about it, there are really a lot of addresses you can go to, and I can just recommend Girl Security, for example, on Twitter. They're really active and they're really open to everyone who's willing to join, and the mentorship opportunities you will get there are absolutely amazing. And then other than that, I think from all of us, it's just demanded that we have a consciousness towards the issue. yeah, try not to speak on manuals, and thanks so much, Marina, for sparing us from this happening here. But yeah, I also see, this consciousness, it's building up in this field, and it's amazing to see. And even though we are not yet at the level that we want to be, I think we're getting there, and I think progress is being made, as slow as it may be, but I think we're in a good way.
Yeah, I'd like to reiterate everything that the fellow panelists have said. I think it's something that we have to look at a lot of the barriers earlier. So barriers of entries at the university level, even before women in STEM and security fields. And I think, as Fabian was saying, just consciousness is the most important thing. If you take a look around in the room and there aren't enough women, it's not acceptable, and it should never be normalized. So I think just if everybody, as much consciousness of that as possible, as much amplification of the correct voices where possible, I think it's a good start. And then it needs to be something, diversity in general needs to be something that it's not a box ticking exercise. It's a really important part of making this feel better. I think as long as everybody understands that, we can go a long way to remedying some of these challenges.
You're muted, Niklas.
Niklas, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. What I wanted to say is Marina got applause and cheers from the audience for her intervention, so maybe you hit a nail here. Going back to the question by Jürgen, I'm not that much wiser now, Jürgen, but I will pitch the question anyway. So it goes to everyone. So whoever wants to feel the need to answer, feel free. So what do you recommend for the EU? I assume in your particular field of expertise, restraint, not participating in qualitative arm races, influence member states. Any thoughts on this?
I can speak to this one and also Alex's question at the same time, because they're both speaking to arms control in these new operational domains, as I understand them. Specifically, Alex is speaking about direct descent anti-satellite capabilities, which is a space-based, well, it's terrestrial-based capability, but it affects satellites, which are obviously space-based infrastructure. So when we're thinking about arms control in these domains like cyber and space, a lot of what I'm hearing is that we're shifting our focus from bean counting, which is what Niklas called it at the beginning, which made me laugh. So focusing on shifting it from a focus on capabilities, aka bean counting, to a focus on behaviors, because we can't count these capabilities or quantify them in the same way, or verify them in the same way. That's not to say that there isn't space for verification. And actually, myself and Anu at VERTIC are thinking about this a lot right now. And so what we're seeing is the UK is actually quite a thought leader in this space right now. So they've made a UN proposal or UN resolution on responsible behaviors for reducing space risks. And it really is, again, focusing on this behavioral element of it. So to Jürgen's point about what we should be recommending for the EU, I think that we could be talking about these behaviors in that space and in the UN forum as well, as our way of kind of moving forward on this.
So thank you very much. We are reaching the end of this session, but the organizers granted us some additional minutes. So let me ask one question, which you could combine with your summary of the session. And the question would be, we talked a lot about that we have to break up silos, that we have to combine conventional and the strategic side, WMDs. But what I've seen is that experts in particular fields like have made themselves a cozy place in their silo. Like if you talk to people, for example, to think about the implications of AI in their field, they always go, well, I'm an expert for X, but not for AI. And I'm an expert on something else, but not on missiles. So how can we break up those silos in the thinking of the researchers and to make them open to those connections here? And I'm really, it strikes me, because when you ask people to attend conferences and to talk about the impact of emerging technologies on their particular field, they always hesitate, but you don't. So you're the next generation which doesn't. So what can we learn from you how to break up those silos? And again, whoever wants to go first has the floor.
Well, I think partially that those conversations are stilted because the technical understanding of these capabilities creates really high barriers to entry into the field. So I said earlier, I want Fabian to answer this question because I'm not a missile technologist. I have hypersonic missiles on this list of technologies that I've asked experts to evaluate, and I know a bit about hypersonics myself, but there's so much in each of these technology areas that I've covered. So I've split into two domains, but even within those domains, you have quantum capabilities, you have AI, you have these kind of cyber-based, you have enabling technologies and weapon systems. Like there's so many different sub-categorizations of these technologies that do make the barriers to entry very high, and it makes it difficult to have these conversations across disciplines. I think what's important from my perspective is that we include both policy people and technical folk. So folks who understand the technical side of these capabilities, because for me, in my research, I've seen that as political scientists or people who may not be so familiar with the technical aspects of these technologies, we are, and I include myself in this, we're susceptible to overhyping or overestimating the impact of these technologies even if we don't fully understand them. And so I think it's important to have a really diverse cross-section of individuals in this space, from industry, from government, from the policy world, from technology world, who are all able to bring their own piece to this. And I think that in diversifying the people that we have at the table, that's a way of getting towards a more reasonable, more measured outcome. So that's kind of my 2 cents. Yeah.
Thank you.
I fully agree with what Marina just said, and but at the same time, I also think we should not overstate these technical barriers. When I was talking about, for example, liquid fuel, solid fuel, I don't need to know the chemical properties of them. Like I have no idea, to be honest. I just know I know the difference in effect between the two, and maybe I can also say which fuel is more efficient, PJ10 or PJ11. It's just two different types of fuels, and these are things that you can learn even if you do not have the technical background. That luckily, and I think so, that's also increasingly so. Luckily, we get more and more people into this field that actually have real technical expertise, and we all can learn a lot from them. But at the same time, don't be discouraged just because there's someone who talks about the issue in an extremely technical manner, while you're just not at that level, and probably I will never get to the level of a physicist or a chemist when it comes to talk about missile capabilities. But there are so many resources out there that explain this stuff in a very accessible manner, and they go relatively deep into the matter while not going so deep and making it so complicated that it's creating barriers for those outside the technical fields. So I think what we need there is a bit of courage. Probably it's also just that we're just inherently afraid to make mistakes and not being perfect. And our field is getting more and more complex, and then it is probably going to be the case once in a while that our answers are not perfect, but we should not be afraid of that. We should actually encourage that, because that encourages debate, and this debate brings the field forward. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that this is definitely something that's incredibly important in my view, that everybody does break out of their different silos. It's something that I experience in my work actually on a daily basis, that if we're looking to draft some legislation, for example, in a state, at a workshop, you are going to need so many different stakeholders from so many different parts of government and even outside government, and with so many different levels of expertise. Sometimes the hardest part of the job is getting the experts from customs, health, defense, foreign affairs, trade, industry, all in the same room, and all talking together, because otherwise you're not going to have a comprehensive approach to legislation. So it's something that I do believe is incredibly important. And I think two ways to remedy the issue at a broader level are that I think, as even emerging experts in our field, we have to do a better job of briefly explaining what we do to other people. I think, especially in organizations such as my own VERTIC, where we have different teams with different experience, something that we found quite useful is just having more collaboration and conversations between the teams, even within an organization, where we just sit down sometimes and explain our projects or explain our findings. And if you can explain it in a way that somebody with a completely different background can understand very, very quickly, then I think that will increase knowledge at all levels. And if we do that, rather than trying to retreat into our comfort zones of this is my expertise, I'm the only one to know it, and really try and disseminate information, it can enrich discussions and also help to get us somewhere.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think these are great ideas how to tackle these problems. And I said in the beginning that we will have the chance to answer questions here, but now there's still popping up questions in the Q&A, but I think we have reached the end of this session. I will just, you can actually post your questions to the participants on Twitter. I just posted all the handles, so you can now follow them. You can post your questions there. All which is left to me is thank you very much. I guess we have learned a lot and have given many ideas to think about. I will definitely look up several texts now once you are gone, yeah, because I feel like, okay, I have to catch up here and there. So thank you very much. As it is a virtual format, my applause has to be sufficient. So thank you very much. And yeah, last thing, organizational-wise, we will reconvene at 1400. So now you can log out, log back in, and be back at 1400. Thanks again to all the panelists and to the audience for the great questions. Bye.